Get ready, because today we're going to talk about head hopping, what it is, how to use it, and why in most cases you shouldn't use it. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. I just want to say thank you to everyone who picked up a copy of Bad Parts this past week. Your support was huge, and you helped me become a #1 Amazon bestseller in multiple genre categories. That is just awesome. So thank you to everyone in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia for supporting me, taking a chance on my writing. I hope you enjoy the story, and I also hope you leave a review when you're done, because reviews are critical to a book's success. But let's get back to business. Today I want to talk about head hopping, and this was a request from one of my subscribers. He said to me, Brandon, can you do a video on head hopping and how to use it? And I thought it was an interesting question, because most of the time when you hear about head hopping in regards to writing, the gurus are telling you don't do it, never do it, it's a terrible thing. Head hopping is something you should avoid in your writing, and that is true for the most part, but we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to explain what it is, why it's dangerous in most cases, and then toward the end of the video I'm going to tell you how to actually use head hopping effectively. I've got an example from a Stephen King book that we'll look at. But let's start with the definition. Head hopping is jumping from one character's point of view to another character's point of view within a single scene. And this is the idea of switching from one perspective to another, back and forth, all over the place. You're slipping into one character's private thoughts and then into another character's private thoughts, or their emotions, maybe their internal sensations, and so on and so on. And basically what you're doing, I think the easiest way to explain this is to say that you're giving mind-reading powers to characters who aren't mind readers. Now let me give you a bad example just to illustrate what head hopping is. This is going to be a very simple example. It's going to be written from first person point of view, the I point of view, and we're going to say, I sat down to watch the Super Bowl. On the TV, Patrick Mahomes threw an incompletion and wondered if his wife still loved him. So this is head hopping because we should be grounded in the I character's point of view. And that I character should not know what is going on in Patrick Mahomes' mind. And that brings us to the dangers of head hopping. Head hopping can create confusion in your stories. Most readers expect a story to follow one point of view until there is a chapter break or a scene break. But if you have characters head hopping, if you are jumping back and forth into different minds, that can be confusing for your reader. And even if they are able to follow what's going on, it can exhaust your reader. If they're jumping from all these different points of views, it can get exhausting, it can wear down their enthusiasm for the story. And then the final thing to be wary about is the idea of head hopping limiting the mystery, suspense, and tension in your story. A lot of what's fun about a story is that we don't know what all the different characters are thinking or what they're capable of. And if you tell us that, oh, this character is thinking that and that character is thinking this, that robs us of that mystery, suspense, and tension. Now, despite these dangers, a lot of writers still continue to head hop. Some of them do it intentionally, some of them do it unintentionally, but whatever the reason, it's often because the writer wants to tell the reader something that the point of view character doesn't know. There's often some important piece of information that needs to be there in order for the story to work, and because the point of view character doesn't know that, all of a sudden the writer will jump into another character's head. Now, in most cases, you want to avoid head hopping, and the best way of doing this is to focus on one point of view character at a time. And if you are going to switch from one point of view to another, make sure that you have a scene break or a chapter break, and then when you do start that next scene or that next chapter, make sure you introduce that new point of view character as soon as possible. And if you are still having issues with head hopping, maybe it just keeps creeping into your stories or it's a bad habit of yours, there are some solutions. You can always rewrite or revise scenes, or you can find alternative ways of injecting information. Let me give you another example. I'm going to start with a bad example, and then I'm going to change it up so that it gets rid of the head hopping. So we'll start with our bad example first. Once again, we're going to have a first-person narrator here. I watched the Super Bowl with some friends. When the Eagles scored, my buddy Jack pumped his fist in celebration. Then the Chiefs got the ball back and his stomach tightened. Now the problem with this example is that last part with his stomach tightening. If the narrator is this first person I, that I person cannot know how Jack feels internally. He can't know that Jack's stomach is tightening within him. So let's rewrite this so that there's no head hopping. I watched the Super Bowl with some friends. When the Eagles scored, my buddy Jack pumped his fist in celebration. Then the Chiefs got the ball back, and he pressed a shaky hand against his stomach. So with this rewrite here, I got rid of the head hopping. Instead of that internal sensation of the stomach tightening, something that only Jack would be able to know about, I changed it to something visual, something that an outside observer could notice. And it sends the same message. It tells us that, okay, Jack is nervous about the rest of the game, he's anxious about it, but he pressed a shaky hand against his stomach. That is a visual cue instead of an internal cue as to what he's feeling. Now, so far I talked about how you shouldn't be using head hopping, and this applies to stories that are going to be written in first person or third person limited. In other words, you're limited to one character's point of view. However, you can head hop if you are going to use third person omniscient, and I'm going to talk about that now. This is the only time when head hopping is acceptable. But what the omniscient point of view is, this is when you have a narrator who has godlike knowledge of the story. And it's important to remember that this narrator is not a character within the story. It's just a disembodied voice who is telling the story, and this voice has godlike knowledge. They know everything about what happens within the story. They know all the characters' backstories, everything that will happen, everything that happens outside of the story itself, and so on and so on. And it's important to keep in mind that this is not a multi-point of view story. This is not just a series of different point of views. There is one particular narrator, and that narrator has a consistent voice. And this narrator might include details that the characters don't see or they aren't aware of. This narrator might foreshadow things that haven't happened yet. Now, if you are using an omniscient narrator, you can use head hopping in your stories, but you have to do it intentionally, and you have to make sure you know what you're doing. This is very important, and keep in mind that omniscient point of view is not easy to master. You got to read a lot of books, you got to familiarize yourself with it, you got to master it over time so you can use it effectively. And if you do use head hopping and you want to transition from one character's point of view to another in the same scene, you need to find a way to signal to the reader that you're about to head hop. Usually the best way of doing this is by starting a new paragraph. Now let's look at an example from the book Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is one of my favorite books. I love it to death. It's about a small town that gets overrun by vampires, and we're going to pick things up in chapter 4, at the very beginning of chapter 4. And what happens here is that two young boys are late coming home for dinner. The parents worry about them. Where are they at? And this opening to chapter 4 gives us a lot of head hopping, and in the first paragraph we see things from the perspective of the boy's mother, Marjorie Glick. Then in paragraphs 2 and 3 we see things from the perspective of the boy's father, Tony Glick, and then finally in paragraph 4 we see things from the perspective of the sons, Danny and Ralphie. I'm going to read these paragraphs for you right now. Pay attention to how the point of view jumps from one to another. Danny and Ralphie Glick had gone out to see Mark Petrie with orders to be in by 9, and when they hadn't come home by 10 past, Marjorie Glick called the Petrie house. No, Mrs. Petrie said, the boys weren't there, hadn't been there. Maybe your husband better talk to Henry. Mrs. Glick handed the phone to her husband, feeling the lightness of fear in her belly. The men talked it over. Yes, the boys had gone by the woods path. No, the little brook was very shallow at this time of year, especially after the fine weather. No more than ankle deep. Henry suggested that he start from his end of the path with a high-powered flashlight, and Mr. Glick start from his. Perhaps the boys had found a woodchuck burrow or smoking cigarettes or something. Tony agreed and thanked Mr. Petrie for his trouble. Mr. Petrie said it was no trouble at all. Tony hung up and comforted his wife a little. She was frightened. He had mentally decided that neither of the boys was going to be able to sit down for a week when he found them. But before he had even left the yard, Danny stumbled out from the trees and collapsed beside the backyard barbecue. He was dazed and slow-spoken, responding to questions ploddingly and not always sensibly. There was grass in his cuffs and a few autumn leaves in his hair. He told his father that he and Ralphie had gone down the path through the woods, had crossed Crockett Brook by the stepping stones, and had gotten up the other bank with no trouble. Then Ralphie began to talk about a ghost in the woods. Danny neglected to mention that he had put this idea in his brother's head. Ralphie said he could see a face. Danny began to be frightened. He didn't believe in ghosts or any kid stuff like the boogeyman, but he did think he had heard something in the dark. So this is a good example of head hopping, and we know it's head hopping because we see different internal feelings, internal sensations, internal thoughts. And it's made clear by the use of paragraph breaks. The first paragraph belongs to the mother. Paragraphs 2 and 3 belong to the father. Paragraph 4 belongs to the son. And another thing I want to point out here, and this is great at the end of the first paragraph, Mrs. Glick handed the phone over to her husband. That's almost like passing the baton over in terms of point of view. She hands the phone over to her husband, she's handing the point of view over to her husband as well. And that's a great way to signal to the reader that point of view is changing. So I hope this helps. Question of the day, do you ever unintentionally use head hopping in your stories? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my books. Bad Parts is great if you like small town horror. It's about people trading away their sick and injured body parts in order to get healthy again. And then Entry Wounds is about a guy who picks up a haunted gun and he cannot put it down until he kills 6 people with it. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.